we are doomed to extinction because of agriculture. We have raped and pillaged this planet. There is a disinformation program literally for everyone, no matter who you are and what your interests are, what your beliefs are, which way you're focusing. There is a website set up just for you to take you in and to vector your thinking and your attention into the way that they want you to think. Categories for things happening in the sky and the cosmos. If you read the scientific reports that come through and put the pieces together, you can see something big is happening.
Welcome to SOTT Talk Radio. I'm Neil Bradley, and with me tonight is Joe Quinn. Hi there. We're also joined this week by Jason Martin. Welcome back, Jay.
Thank you.
So, this week we're going to be talking about the terror threats. It's been some 12 years now since 9/11. Hardly a day goes by where there's some reminder of the evil thing out there. We bring endless stories, of course, in the news, the latest terror threats and what it means for us, what it means for our lives. In fact, I mean, at this point, you couldn't be able to keep it. There are so many incidents, obviously in the U.S., but it's a global issue as well. But we're going to be talking about the terror threat from obviously affecting our lives, but also get into what's rooted in it. It's important to understand that it serves pretty particular objectives. I think you agree, Joe, that we don't hear about.
Yes, absolutely. What most people hear about is the direct threat to their lives from terrorism, specifically Muslim or Arab terrorism. And that's by design, of course. As we've talked about in previous shows, the terrorism is to essentially, it's basically political control. It's a large-scale setup, and there's no better emotion than fear to control people. So, and terrorism does that job very well of controlling people through fear, through a direct threat to their lives. But obviously there is a hidden agenda, another agenda behind that, as with any case where any power or government attempts to control people, they're doing it for a specific reason. Of course, just controlling people can be a means to an end in itself, but there's also other agendas being served by this terror threat. And in fact, as we'll try to explain through the course of the terror threat is actually bogus. There really isn't to the world, to America, to the West, to our freedoms and democracies, to our Dunkin' Donuts and coffee and Super Bowls.
There was a time when if someone had told me that, I would have said you're pulling my leg, because it's so prevalent. There's everywhere. How can there be nothing there?
Well, there's evidence for it, right? That's why people don't believe it. Evidence for a terror threat in the form of terrorist attacks.
Right.
People have been. So that's an important ingredient in the plan to convince people the reality of a terror threat. Well, you have to manufacture the reality of a terror threat.
Okay. It's an incredible concept when you think about it. I mean, a war on terror. What is terror? Terror is an extremely negative human emotion, right? So what are we going to do? We're going to declare a war on your worst fears.
Yeah, but it's also a tactic. A war on terrorism, so it's a tactic. But in the same way, it's a bit implausible to wage a global war on a tactic.
Well, I think that the most interesting thing about the entire situation is that the more war they declare on terror, the more terrified people become. And so it's kind of like, obviously it's not working. I mean, because people are becoming more and more afraid. And, what's that definition of insanity? is doing the same thing again and again and expecting different results. So, I mean, it's not really working because people are more afraid than they were before.
Well, that's the point.
I mean, before 9/11, I was never afraid of terrorism. Now I'm always afraid of it. And, you know, with each year, you're always getting more and more afraid. And it's just like, hey, wait a minute, hold on a second here. You know, it's just like they come up with all this GMO stuff, right? We're going to fix starvation. And more people keep starving. So it's like, at what point are we going to say, wait a minute, you know, it's not working?
There's definitely a pattern there. I mean, who was it? Nixon declared a war on drugs.
And yeah, look how bad the situation is now, you know?
So we'll declare a war on something, and somehow it'll metastasize, proliferate, and just get totally out of control.
Well, yeah, because at this point, I mean, you know, people, you gotta start understanding that it's completely and totally manufactured. You know, totally manufactured. It's nothing more than manufactured. If they come out and say that something's important, the exact opposite of what they're saying is important. If they say that terrorism is a danger, terrorism is not a danger. Look in the exact opposite direction. You know, it's when they. You know, I mean, that's basically like the way it's become. You know.
I hear, but as Joe just mentioned, there are real cases where actual, in quotes, terrorist attack happens, and people do die as a result.
Yeah. So yeah, obviously, and like I said, an important ingredient in convincing people the reality of war or the reality of our threat is to carry out terrorist attacks. I mean, it's against our people feel it as a threat, a personal threat against their own lives. So the way you can convince that is to attack them personally. You take their lives and you publicize it widely, so that the people who have been directly affected by the attack but get to feel a little bit of it as well.
But then by their own sort of bullshit that they propagate, that just creates more, you know? I mean, that just supposedly makes them hate you even more. So it's like the more you kill them, the more they spring up. It's the...
Well, no, we're talking here about people at home, like attacking people that you want to convince of the reality of a terror threat. Attack those people to make them believe the terror threat against them is real. Of course, like what you're saying as well is true, is that the war on terrorism has done nothing. It hasn't created far more terrorism than or far more potential or even real terrorists.
I think that there are real terrorists. I think there really are. I think that there are real terrorists out there, and I think that there are more today than there were you know, on 9/11 type situation, obviously, because of all the crap that, you know, the Western powers have been doing, and they just treat it.
Of course, but then you can't really call those people terrorists. If
I mean, we should be honest about the term terrorism. I mean, terrorism is defined by an established authority. Anyone who's like just, you know, crap against them, basically. You know, they choose how they're going to define terrorism. You know, I mean, the English called the American revolutionaries terrorists.
Of course,
you know? I mean, that's just what they do.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, so they try to make it personal for Americans or people in the West and Europe, Western Europe and America. They try to make it personal by saying that people like terrorists, but that's not enough. They tell people in the West that these terrorists hate you for your freedoms and for who you are. They hate you because you're free. These terrorists hate freedom. They don't like being free themselves. I mean, they lock themselves up every day just to feel a little bit of anti-freedom.
The government doesn't want to admit the fact that the terrorists, quote unquote, let's just pretend they exist for a minute, even though that's a questionable situation. The terrorists hate the government because of what they feel the government did to them, right? And so the government's sitting there saying, like, no, they hate you for your freedoms, because nobody says no. They don't want people to wake up and say, well, what the hell did you guys do to make these guys hate you so much?
Yeah, that's why they have to.
What have you been doing? Well, we weren't.
That's why they have to pass off the implausible narrative that there are a large number of people who simply hate the idea of freedom, and therefore anybody who adheres to the ideas of freedom or supports the idea of freedom or lives supposedly a free life, then you're by definition hated by the terrorists. Because, as I said, these terrorists they actually hate freedom. They every day, terrorists lock themselves up. You know, they handcuff themselves behind their back and throw themselves into a small kind of like box just to indulge their love of anti-freedom.
Right. Yeah,
obviously.
Totally. Yeah.
I mean, obviously they do that because they hate freedom. I mean, how can they even just walk around in the street and feel freedom when they hate it so much? It must piss them off seriously. And then when they see Americans walking around streets and going into like Dunkin' Donuts and stuff, Jesus Christ, I would be livid.
Gurdjieff once said, you know, if you want to understand men's behavior, you know, think about yourself and how you act. You know, judge them by yourself. And that's what Americans should do. They should sit there and say, wait a minute, under what conditions do I hate somebody with such vehemence that I would do horrible things? And none of them just hate arbitrarily. No one hates arbitrarily. That's just that's complete and total bullshit. That's a fantasy person. A fantasy person who hates without reason. You know? The reason could be wrong. Hey, they could totally be wrong. Mm-hmm. But no one just wakes up one day and says, oh, I'm going to hate somebody so bad that I'll blow myself and my babies to do something bad to them. Nobody does that. You know, you have to be driven to that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that's the experience of most normal people. And so a normal person hearing this kind of rhetoric from the government should take pause and say, hey, wait a minute. Nobody acts like that. What did you do to make them so pissed at you? You know, and it turns out you did like quite a lot of things, actually.
Well, according to the British government, mothers do wake up and blow up their own babies because they hate freedom so much. This is a story from 2006. Hunt on for baby bombers. Hate-filled mums willing to sacrifice themselves and their babies are being hunted in the war on terror. Security sources confirmed last night that alleged baby bombers were among those arrested over the plot to massacre thousands by downing transatlantic flights. Let's see. The discovery prompted fears that there were fanatical mothers in secret al-qaeda cells in Britain ready to become suicide bombers and die with their tots in their arms.
I mean,
and that's not tongue-in-cheek. I mean, that was seriously like...
I finally found... I've been trying for like months to find a term for this, right? I talked to you before about this, and I've decided to call it and-thinning. You know when you were a kid and you were on the schoolyard, right? And there was that kid who was trying to gross out the girls, and there would be some girls there, and there would be a little boy, and he'd be either trying to do something or say something to him and go, ew, it's disgusting, right? And he would say, you know, like, and then the guy had, you know, boogers coming out of his nose, and then nobody's surprised. He was like, and then he ate them, you know, and everything keeps getting progressively worse, right?
Yeah.
And that's what these guys are doing. It's like, it's this puerile schoolyard mentality of, and then they do this. Oh, that doesn't surprise you? Oh, and then they might do this, you know, and they just keep upping the ante until they get some sort of shock or rise out of you, and it's just...
Yeah, and the telltale sign is that they go too far, and things become so implausible.
Yeah. Well,
they keep trying now. They keep trying, but I mean, there was
at one point in that article, he says it may seem beyond belief, but we're convinced it's true, right? And it's that's like, you know, if something's too good to be true, it probably isn't. If something's beyond belief, it's probably not true. And the reason they say that is because they kind of realize in their head, you know, that, wow, this is really kind of like out there, and people won't believe it, but they have to say, but we're utterly convinced. It's like bullshit. You know, you're convinced. You're making it up.
We've had an underwear bomber.
Yeah.
A bra bomber, I believe, or an attempted bra bomber. A shoe bomber.
Well, boob bomber, really. It was. The boob bomber was the allegation that terrorists would use...
silicone implants lined with C4?
or just C4 implants masquerading as silicone implants. And they were,
God.
These people, I really think I have to kind of laugh at the situation because I begin to wonder. I know it's really horrible. It's really totally horrible, the kind of stuff that these guys are talking about and what they're doing to populations and what they're terrifying people. But in a certain sense, I mean, a lot of this stuff seems like it was written by a comedian, you know, who is just sitting there trying to come up with the most absurd claim possible. And it seems like they have like a competition between them, like which government can come up with the most absurd claim about what the terrorists are going to be doing, you know, ink cartridges, you know, explosive breast implants, you know, and there's like this psychopathic kind of like, you know, one-upmanship game of who can come up with the most absurd conspiracy and get people to believe it, you know?
Yeah, I think it is made up because it fits a psychopathic mindset of not really knowing, not really dealing in facts or reality, but basically what comes out of my head is reality. It's the truth is a fact. So
and not really
under those conditions, anything goes, really, you know.
I think they're gaming people, you know. I mean, I think that they're really sort of like chuckling to themselves, like, I want to say this. You know, let's see if they believe it. And
I wouldn't be surprised.
I mean, I don't think that they actually believe this stuff. No, they don't believe this stuff. They're just making it up, they're trying to pull the wool over people's eyes and getting off on it. It's duper's delight, that's all it is. It's the delight of getting people to believe you when you've told them, a complete bullshit story.
The thing is, and substantial numbers of people do believe more or less these stories. I mean, obviously, I'm sure they raise their eyebrows like us at these tales, but enough of them must believe it that they are going along with it.
Well, there's a fear factor,
Yeah.
And the problem is true. Yeah. Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, the problem is that there are some Muslims, because this is a Muslim terror threat, not just any old terror threat, but it's largely a Muslim terror threat. And there are some Muslims, let's say intellectually challenged Muslims from, inner city areas of Western Europe and America who kind of get caught up in the whole propaganda, the other side of the propaganda, which is equally controlled by Western governments, which is, they control al-qaeda, in quotes, propaganda by disseminating it. And there's these young kind of gullible Muslim guys who get caught up in it and who will hatch plots kind of thing, but really ill-conceived plots that they have no chance in hell of ever pulling off. But of course, in the UK, for example, MI5 would be listening in, would have identified them, or someone would have mentioned them to the police in a hysterical kind of society, tell on your neighbour type thing. So they'd listen into them and they'd hear the details of their plot. There was one just a few weeks ago in Birmingham in the UK where these three guys, they were unemployed. They were kind of scam artists. They were posing as charity workers for a Muslim charity and then just keeping the money and stuff. And they had been talking, all this had been recorded by MI5, the British Intelligence Service. They had been talking with each other while they were tooling around in their car in the evening looking for something to do about, carrying out some bombing or something. We'll shoot people or we'll go and get people. And one of their ideas was to attach blades to a monster truck, to the wheels of a monster truck, and drive it through a crowded area. And so this was the level of discourse that you're dealing with in these people, but it's being recorded by MI5. And they take it to court and the media, spreads it far and wide. It's going to be worse than the 7/7 bombings. And these three guys come across as complete idiots with no chance whatsoever of ever doing anything that they're talking about. Just blowhards, basically.
Yeah. Right.
And like I said, a bit intellectually challenged as well. But they're used as fodder for the war and terror mill and spread the threat. The renewed threat is spread by the media, and it's just ridiculous, and that has happened over and over again. And in the since 9/11, those kind of events have been the meat and bones, or meat and potatoes of the terror threat. They have those kind of things have been the evidence for the reality of a terror threat continuing to exist since 9/11, and those three guys in Birmingham they more came up with it themselves. I mean, they didn't have any bombing materials. They didn't have any plans. One of them thought that one of them had been talking about a sports drink, and that there were chemicals in the sports drink that it could make a bomb out of. So that was the extent of their planning and their plot.
Brondo.
Brondo. But that's what
got what suicide bombers crave.
Yeah. Bomb making materials. So
it has electrolytes.
Yeah. So they, but nevertheless, they were held up by the media and by the government as a serious terror threat, and they're like, we missed that one by the skin. These guys were going to do some serious damage.
I mean, they were gonna steal the gravedigger, attach blades to his wheels, and drive through.
Yeah.
What's the famous
Camden Market or something?
Camden Market with gravedigger.
Yeah. But I mean, those guys supposedly came up with themselves. Although I don't know if they may well have had a helper from the government. But many other incidents like that over the past, since 9/11 really, have all involved, and particularly in the US, but also in the UK, but particularly in the US, basically a sting operation, entrapment by the authorities, by the FBI. Right. The FBI have mounted literally dozens.
I think it's hundreds.
Yeah, but really well publicized ones.
Right.
Of operations like the sting operations, where they find, like I said again, some inner city, impoverished, intellectually challenged young guys. They don't even have to be Muslim sometimes. And they set them up to be terrorists because there is no other evidence of this terrorist threat. So they have to find evidence. So basically the FBI will either do it directly or they'll have one of their informants go and contact this guy. And like one of the, let me see, one of them from, there was one from 2009. May 20, 2009, U.S. law enforcement arrested 4 black Muslim men in connection with a plot to shoot down military airplanes flying out of an Air National Guard base in Newburgh, New York, and blow up 2 synagogues. So they were arrested in May 2009. 4 men were identified as, they've got 4 names. They were basically 27, 28, 32. One of them was 55. And they were all residents of Newburgh in upstate New York. The lawyer filed a motion to have the case dismissed on the grounds that the plot to bomb synagogues was entirely the brainchild of the FBI, and the men were used by the FBI's professional informant, Shahid Hussein. The defendant's lawyer claimed that Hussein's job involved visiting suburban mosques in an effort to find members with anti-American leanings and recruit them to join a fake terror plot, supposedly funded by a Pakistan-based group. And here's the interesting part. This is par for the course in these kind of sting operations. In baiting the men, the FBI informant drove around in an FBI-supplied BMW or a Hummer and other cars to make him appear well-funded. He suggested to the defendants that he could provide them with $250,000. He attempted to incite the defendants by blaming Jews for the world's evil and telling them that attacks against non-Muslims were endorsed by Islam. These guys didn't know this, apparently.
They weren't.
He suggested targets that the defendants wanted to attack. He paid for the defendants' groceries. He bought them a gun. He provided fake bombs and missiles. He assembled explosive devices for them, and he acted as their chauffeur. And these guys basically saw this guy and said, we can get some money out of this guy, so let's just, pretend.
Play along.
Let's play along. Yeah, we want to be terrorists. Just keep the money coming, keep buying our groceries and driving us around. And so the upshot of those kind of cases is that at a certain point, when the FBI informant hands them this, plastic bomb or something, the FBI swoop in, grab them, and it's a terror plot foiled.
Yeah. And
a real near miss, that one.
It's all over the headlines.
Yeah.
Of course, when it comes to court, it usually collapses. But it doesn't matter because by then you're already on the next story.
Yeah, the thing is,
you've moved on.
No, but very often it doesn't collapse. Well, very often the people are sent down for years.
Yeah.
Oh, right.
On the basis of this, it doesn't collapse at all. That's the horrible thing.
I mean, the big problem there is you get four stupid people like that. Whether we have to sort of define whether or not they were mentally retarded, which it does actually sound like maybe they could have been. Or, a bunch of little opportunistic assholes who want to play that game. To be quite honest, I'm not really going to cry about them going to jail after, being willing to play along even for money. That's actually a little bit more distasteful that they were willing to play along with such an idea for money. That's kind of actually a little bit sickening.
Well, they're usually petty criminals,
Yeah, obviously that's a contrived situation, and I don't think I've actually read of a real terrorist attack, to be quite honest. I've read a couple of accounts of so-called terrorist situations and terrorism, but I don't think I've ever read a real one. I believe in the possibility of terrorism. Totally. I believe in the possibility of any kind of terrorism.
I believe in the possibility. I believe in the reality of it, but that it's perpetrated by governments all around the world and always has been.
Well, yeah. This is essentially Trinquier and Frank Kitson. The Kitson doctrine. That came out of Algeria and Malaysia and Kenya, which is basically they came up with this whole idea that in order to inoculate the population, as they put it, of course they're putting it in their way, that in order to inoculate the population against the possibility of being revolutionized against the government, they had to basically perpetrate a propaganda and terrorism campaign against their own citizens to get them to hate
the people they wanted to conquer.
They hate those people, and they basically explicitly say this. Trinquier explicitly says it in his book, and Kitson also talks about the same sort of process. So it's an established way of doing it. It's mind war. It's mind war directed against, it's propaganda and mind war against your own population.
Speaking of informants and entrapment, I was watching earlier today The Power of Nightmares, a great documentary made by a British guy. His name escapes me. But there's a 10-minute section there on the origins of al-qaeda. Yeah. Specifically, you've got the clip of that there.
I do indeed.
Excellent. I think we should play that for people because this is the first time that al-qaeda gets mentioned, at least in the West. This is January 2001, before the attacks, 9/11.
Okay.
Even bin Laden's displays of strength for the Western media were faked. The fighters in this video had been hired for the day and told to bring their own weapons. For beyond his own small group, bin Laden had no formal organization, until the Americans invented one for him. In January 2001, a trial began in a Manhattan courtroom of 4 men accused of the embassy bombings in East Africa. But the Americans had also decided to prosecute bin Laden in his absence. But to do this under American law, the prosecutors needed evidence of a criminal organization, because as with the mafia, that would allow them to prosecute the head of the organization, even if he could not be linked directly to the crime. And the evidence for that organization was provided for them by an ex-associate of bin Laden's called Jamal al-Fadl.
During the investigation of the 1998 bombings, there is a walk-in source, Jamal al-Fadl, who's a Sudanese militant who was with bin Laden in the early 90s, who has been passed around a whole series of Middle Eastern secret services, none of whom want much to do with him, who ends up in America and is taken on by the American government effectively as a key prosecution witness and given a huge amount of American taxpayers' money at the same time. His account is used as raw material to build up a picture of al-Qaeda. The picture that the FBI want to build up is one that will fit the existing laws that they will have to use to prosecute those responsible for the bombing. Now, those laws were drawn up to counteract organised crime, the mafia, drugs crime, crimes where people being a member of an organisation is extremely important. You have to have an organisation to get a prosecution. And you have al-Fadl and a number of other witnesses, a number of other sources who are happy to feed into this, who've got material that looked at in a certain way can be seen to show this organisation's existence. You put the two together and you get what is the first bin Laden myth, the first al-Qaeda myth, and because it's one of the first, it's extremely influential.
The picture al-Fadl drew for the Americans of bin Laden was of an all-powerful figure at the head of a large terrorist network that had an organised hierarchy of control. He also said that bin Laden had given this network a name, al-Qaeda. It was a dramatic and powerful picture of bin Laden, but it bore little relationship to the truth. The reality was that bin Laden and Ayman Zawahiri had become the focus of a loose association of disillusioned Islamist militants who were attracted by the new strategy. But there was no organisation. These were militants who mostly planned their own operations and looked to bin Laden for funding and assistance. He was not their commander. There is also no evidence that bin Laden used the term al-Qaeda to refer to the name of a group until after September the 11th, when he realised that this was the term the Americans had given him. In reality, Jamal al-Fadl was on the run from bin Laden, having stolen money from him. In return for his evidence, the Americans gave him witness protection in America and hundreds of thousands of dollars. Many lawyers at the trial believed that al-Fadl exaggerated and lied to give the Americans the picture of a terrorist organisation that they needed to prosecute bin Laden.
And there were selective portions of al-Fadl's testimony that I believe was false to help support the picture that he helped the Americans join together. I think he lied in a number of specific testimony about a unified image of what this organization was. It made al-Qaeda the new mafia or the new communists. It made them identifiable as a group, and therefore made it easier to prosecute any person associated with al-Qaeda for any acts or statements made by bin Laden, who talked a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Conveniently.
Yeah. Bin Laden.
Whenever anybody was saying, like, oh, the terror threat's not so bad, then bin Laden would make a video, oh, by the way, the terror threat's very real!
Yeah, bin Laden, in quotes, would make a video because, you know, I'm sure people are aware that there have been many videos of bin Laden and also audios of bin Laden, and very few of them seem to actually be bin Laden. In fact, several of them are clearly not bin Laden in the videos, and at least one audio, the voice has been confirmed as not being bin Laden by a Swiss lab.
Have you ever read 1984, where the people would do like I think it was called like the 2 minutes hate or whatever it was. They would go into the theater, they would see like a whole bunch of like people getting shot up and guts spilling everywhere, and they would laugh and cheer and stuff like that. And then at the end, there would be this big head on the screen of Emmanuel Goldstein, and he would say stuff like, I hate your whatever and the goodness of your government and all this different stuff.
I hate you for your freedoms.
I hate you for your freedoms. And that, you know, and it was kind of really convenient that this Emmanuel Goldstein guy kept making all these videos justifying the war against them type of thing, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I think it's later revealed that Emmanuel Goldstein is just working for the government, or maybe he was dead or something. I don't know. They were making it all up, basically. And that's who bin Laden was. You know, bin Laden's the boogeyman. He's Emmanuel Goldstein. And they killed him off, so now they're going to come up with another one, obviously. But
well, about that, they got, what, nearly 11 years out of him?
Yeah.
And the guy probably died in December. There was a report that he had died on December 13, 2001.
Mm-hmm.
So none of those videos were probably bin Laden saying, yes, I'm al-Qaeda, and yes, I did.
Yeah, the first few might have been...
He never used the name al-Qaeda himself.
No, he didn't, no. And also, they probably had some archive video of him, but yeah, there's a bunch of the later videos where it's clearly an imposter.
Did they have? You know, what was his lip saying? I mean, you know, it's always translated. You don't know what he said, you know?
Well, there was one video where they did get some analysis. So we see him on screen and the subtitles are saying he's saying one thing, and then somebody spoke up and said, I speak that language. He didn't say that at all, you know?
Yeah. They can
but
just say
it
whatever.
doesn't matter. They can get away with it because most people aren't going to pay attention.
Yeah, the guy...
Well, most Western people don't speak Arabic.
For example.
So, you know, it's convenient.
The guy in that audio we just listened to made an interesting point at the end there. I don't know if he made it on purpose, but he said basically that the Muslim terrorist threat is a replacement for the communist threat. And that's very true when you think about it, because what the terrorist threat really is for, what the Muslim terror threat is for, this hidden agenda, apart from scaring people, it also gets people in Western nations to support the war on terror, which is basically American and Western government, Western military intervention in other countries. And that's the kind of hidden agenda. It's, you have to have an enemy to fight. Right. You have to have an enemy entrenched in a certain country who is, you know, in some way supposedly a threat to you. So you have to go and invade that country, occupy it, bomb it.
I mean, like, if you think about it, the American population has lived in perpetual fear since the beginning of World War II. Basically, if you look at it, they've lived in perpetual fear. First it was the fear of the Germans. Once the Germans were done, it was the fear of the communists, and then once the communist situation was taken care of, now it's the fear of the terrorists. The American population has lived in a state of perpetual fear for the better part of almost a century at this point now. It's 70 years now. 70 years of total fear fed by the government. What I think happened is at the end of World War II, the CIA brought, or the OSS at the time actually, brought over the German scientists from Project Paperclip, and the first question that they had to ask is, how did you guys do it? Because it probably blew these guys' mind. How did Hitler maintain such control and get all the population to fund this war and do all these horrible things? Because, man, sure, we'd love to. Because, if you're in the OSS or the CIA, you're a psycho. Just plain and simple, that's just what you are. And so
any of our listeners, are you in the CIA? If you want to contest Jason's statement that you're a psycho, please call in and we will evaluate you live on air.
I don't want any CIA people.
No, okay, don't call in.
Don't call in.
Write us instead. Write us an email.
Write us an email
telling us why you're not a psycho.
I'm not a psycho.
Well, the whole communism thing.
Because there's this whole criminal organization thing, right? This whole charging somebody who's a participant in a criminal organization for the acts committed by their boss, right? This is the whole mafia thing, right? So when you work for an organization that does terrible things from the top, okay, you are culpable for it. We've already established that in our laws. We use that to prosecute al-qaeda. We use that to prosecute the mafia. We should use that to prosecute members of the CIA. Because when the CIA does criminal things, then, it has done something criminal and needs to be prosecuted under the rules that we have established, that when you're an organization and you do bad shit, and there are people, even if that person is just filing papers for the CIA, they are contributing to the giant, horrible machine that did those horrible things, and therefore they are culpable. It's like the accountant for a mafia is still charged just as much as, the enforcer on the street who kills people, just as much as the boss who gives the orders. You're a member of a criminal organization who has done criminal things, and therefore any aid you give to that organization during their criminal activity is a criminal act, as long as you could be said to have been aware that it was actually a criminal act. And there's no possibility that a person in the CIA could not have access to it when we do. And we're just these regular Joes reading the news every day. And we know they're criminal. And if you work for the CIA, you should know it's criminal too. And if you don't, you're a bad person.
Part of the problem is that, much like the mythical al-qaeda, people who are, in quotes, in the CIA often are not actually aware that they're in the CIA, or they they have illusions about being in the CIA. But like the so-called terrorist networks, they're elusive. Their membership is not defined. It's not on paper. They have some things on paper. Yeah. There are some people who are officially on the CIA payroll, but we're talking about an organization that is so much bigger than it officially exists.
Oh, absolutely.
Hence its ability to reach in and
right, absolutely.
Spread their corruption all over the world.
Yeah.
You were talking about the connection with communism there. I think there's an interesting point where these two narratives of we're going after this country because there's a communist threat brewing there, or we're going after this country because they're harboring Muslim terrorists.
Yeah.
The two meet in the 70s, late 70s,
in
Afghanistan.
Yeah, most people probably know more or less about the idea that Afghanistan was the breeding ground, supposedly, for modern-day al-qaeda, in that when the Russians invaded Afghanistan, the Americans decided to arm a bunch of fundy, right-wing Muslim nut jobs to fight against them. They give them a bunch of RPGs and anti-aircraft missiles, and that was about it, and lots of money and training, and they fought against the Russians. But the thing about that was that the Russians were baited, as Brzezinski, the national security advisor under Carter, has said. The Americans deliberately provoked the Russians to invade Afghanistan because they knew that they'd be able to bog them down in their Vietnam, as he called it.
Yeah.
But the thing of it is, at the time and in the years leading up to that, the Russians really, Afghanistan at the time was on the border of the Soviet Union. So it was their backyard. It was their sphere of influence, you know. And the Americans were kind of meddling, you know. And it was an unofficial agreement, although it wasn't kept to most of the times. But it was an unofficial agreement that the Soviets had their sphere of influence and the Americans had theirs. And then there were other areas where they kind of fought over them. But Afghanistan definitely was within the Soviet sphere of influence. It was right on their southern border. So the Soviets were happy enough, if the Americans would agree to it, to basically just set up a kind of neutral government in Afghanistan, largely secular and, you know, not hardline either way, not hardline Islamic or not hardline communist or socialist, but and the Russians really didn't want to invade, but the Americans wanted them to invade to give them their Vietnam and just basically make them look bad, bog them down, give them a bad experience.
It was a tar baby kind of situation.
Yeah, but at the same time, the other agenda was to install a right-wing fundamentalist Islamic government, or, you know, put the Fundi Islamists in power, more or less, in Afghanistan, because, I mean, since the Second World War and all of the Americans' imperial adventures, they've always found common cause in a country where there was an option between kind of socialist movement or I mean, in those days they would call themselves communists, but they weren't really communists. They were kind of like, they wanted a social democracy. They wanted basically.
They wanted healthcare and jobs.
They wanted social justice, basically.
I mean, they didn't care what they called it as long as they got healthcare and jobs. You know,
absolutely,
you call it whatever you want.
So that was the natural. In most countries, that's the natural. When people rise up for things, that's what they rise up for. That they have a revolution for. It's like better jobs or jobs. Better pay, better kind of living conditions in general, right. And for the Americans, that's the worst option, basically, because they want to control the country. They want the country to be a client state, and
I never understand it, because they could have their cake and eat it too. You know, I mean, they could have that. I mean,
well,
there's a mean streak about the psychopathic aspect of governments that makes them actively want to not have that, just because they want to hurt people. Like, there's a sadism about them.
There probably is in the psychopathic.
Because you could have an absolute total tyrannical government that still gave you health care and food.
Yeah,
you know, I mean, you could. Yeah, you know. And that wouldn't be as bad as what you end up getting, but it's the mean-spiritedness of pathocrats that makes them.
Exactly. There's definitely that aspect as well. From a political aspect, it's the American government knew, and the CIA knew, that if you allow a social democracy with some nice guy, like in Chile, with Salvador Allende. And there was a guy in Afghanistan at the time before the Soviet invasion. Daoud, his name was. He basically, they were more or less decent people in the sense that they wanted. I mean, Salvador Allende was a great guy, and Daoud in Afghanistan wanted the same things for his people, which was he wanted to free women, basically, and pass land reform, because women at that time were heavily influenced by the whole Islamic code. They weren't allowed out in public and all that kind of stuff, and he wanted to give them jobs in politics and in normal life, and he wanted to change the kind of land system where it was more evenly distributed and all this kind of stuff. But the problem is, if you allow some kind of a option like that to establish a government, and his party to establish a government, those people invariably say, well, you see, our natural resources, we're going to want to keep those for ourselves and for the development of our country. Yeah. And the Americans, fundamentally, in invading any country, want access to those resources for themselves. So that kind of a government is not the kind of government that the Americans have ever supported. And when they're faced with an option between that kind of a government, or that kind of a group taking power, and the Fundi Islamists, who don't really want that kind of thing, because they want to go back. Most of them want to go back to the Stone Age, and they're very small. But with American help, they can become quite large and influential. The Americans always side with the Fundis, and that's what they've done, and that's what they did in Afghanistan. By arming them to fight the Soviets, and then basically allowing them to turn into the Taliban, and then go to war against them later to justify, a renewed invasion. And also, I mean, people probably have heard of the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan. That was initially this group that it was basically these same fundies that the Americans had trained and funded to fight the Soviets. They were now, after the Americans invaded in 2001 or 2002, this Northern Alliance that were helping the Americans to hunt down al-qaeda were basically al-qaeda. They were the same. I mean, not like we've just heard al-qaeda doesn't exist, but so it becomes very complicated in that sense, where you have this them talking about a group that doesn't exist, and you have the American government supporting a group that a while ago supporting a group that is the same as the group that they're fighting. I mean, that's what's going on in Syria today as well. So
yeah, I mean, when you're dealing with any government, I mean, you should just immediately not believe anything that they say, and like I said before, believe the exact opposite. You know, I mean, if they say we're going in to hunt al-Qaeda, they're not. You know, I mean, just automatically invert everything they say. And the thing is that 90% of the time, like, you'll get closer to the truth. And 10%, yeah, maybe they might actually did tell you the truth. But as a general rule, the government wraps 10% of truth and 90% of lies. They take a tiny little kernel of truth and then wrap it up in a big fat lie. And if you just invert it on its head, you'll probably be close to the truth.
And most of those lies are lies by omission.
A lot of that.
The context of Afghanistan, you know, this great big terror threat, this Muslim terror threat. Yeah, the one that you created.
Yeah, well, I'm always big on this, quoting this Alex de Tocqueville, you know. In today's age, you'll be all the more likely to follow a tyrannical government by the very fact that it doesn't appear to be one, because so much of America's power is exercised by indirect implication of things that they don't tell you,
right,
exert power over you, because then you can't make informed choices, right? So this whole concealing information, national security, lies by omission, that's how they exercise their power most of the time. The thing is most people don't see, you know, thousands of soldiers running through the streets, pulling people out of the houses and shooting them. So they think that if it's going to be a dictatorship, or it's going to be fascism, or it's going to be all these horrible, you know, types of governments that they've heard about, that they think that it's going to be like that. But they don't realize that when the Speaker of the House says something, or the White House Secretary does those little things, or, you know, Obama with his State of the Union type of thing, when he lies to you, he is exercising a kind of power over you by not telling you the whole story. And what's even worse is he's exercising another kind of power when he gets you to agree to the fact that it's okay for him to not tell you. The minute that you accept that it's okay for the government not to be transparent, when it's okay for the government to keep secrets and decide what secrets it should keep, you've given away power that you don't really understand what you've given away. And then you have created a kind of tyranny of omissions of abilities of, well, you could do something, but you can't, so you might as well not have these particular rights. You know, you have this freedom of speech, but you can't really do anything with it, so it's kind of really arbitrary that you even have it, you know? And so, and in a certain sense, the tyranny of the American government is not, you know, jackboots in the street with armed people, even though there's a little bit of that. You know, there's all these, you know, heavily armed paramilitary police people in, like, you know, airports and train stations and all this different stuff. So yeah, there's a little bit of that. But as a general rule, the enforcement of this type of tyranny in America is really about controlling the information and about presenting incorrect information to you for you to consume, omitting the truth, fabricating lies, and you don't have access to any other information. You kind of have to do the lie because it's the only thing to eat. It's like, you know, you go into a kitchen and there's a McDonald's hamburger on the table, and that's the only food in the house. It's like, yeah, you're going to eat it. You know, it would be nice to have some steak and potatoes. It would be nice to have a big fat pork chop, but you can't because there's no pork chops. And that's how the government in America specifically, but I think most Western governments have learned to rule this way, because it's extremely difficult to combat. There can be no revolution against that. There really can't. There can't be an armed revolution in the United States. There can't be an armed revolution in the West. It would be pointless, futile, bloody, stupid, corrupted. I mean, it's such a gloriously bad idea to have. There can't be, and that's the solution that they've thought about this from the history of all this different stuff, of all these different revolutions, of all these different sort of revolutionary movements. You know, from all the way back in the days, you know, with James II up into the American Revolution, the Civil War, you know, the Civil Rights Movement, especially, like the Civil Rights Movement and the peace movements of the 60s, that really got them to start thinking, how are we going to prevent this? Because we have all these people who are generally good-hearted and nonviolent, and they're resisting us. They found a way to resist us without shooting at us. It's amazing, right? And so the answer that they came up with is to create this kind of government where all the controls are exerted indirectly. They never come at you directly. They never come at, there's never a policeman at the door saying, if you don't believe what we tell you, we're going to shoot you. They never do that. It's all like, you won't have a job anymore. You know, you won't have a job.
Yeah.
You won't have this. You won't have support. You won't be this. You won't be that. Everything. They organize society. They divide it up, section it off. They organize society to act as counterbalancing forces against each other. So the poor against the rich, and the middle class against the upper class, against this class, against that class, and the people with this and the people with that. And each person in each state is like, I'm California, and all this different stuff. They split people up. They put them into cliques. It's even like Mac users versus Windows users versus Linux users. I mean, they have an infinite level, you know, and they just encourage it. They don't design it. They just encourage that natural tendency in people to group off, and then they antagonize them, and then they start antagonizing each other. It's like what I talked about in my article. It's like they just get the ball rolling. All they did was get the ball rolling, and we see today are just sort of epinomenous of that seed kind of event of just, you know, trying to split people away from each other, and then they just started kind of doing it on their own, you know? So that was very long. I kind of digressed there all over the place. Sorry. Anyway, indirect power, that's how they do it. They're not going to point a gun. There's probably going to be no official removal of the First Amendment or even official removal of the Second Amendment from, like, the Constitution. It's all just going to be by implication and indirection.
Yeah. Well, I was reading somewhere today, the U.S. has not officially declared war since December 1941 against Japan. Right. Every single atrocity has been committed since then. Is implied power at work.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, exactly. It's never on paper.
Never on paper.
So then when you try to drill them on it, they say like, "Well, no, we didn't. We were just going in there to help. We swear."
Yeah.
Prove it.
Yeah.
You know, it's not what you know; it's what you can prove.
What strikes me about the war on terror, there are certain countries that play a leading role. Obviously, the U.S. is talking about mostly here.
Mm-hmm.
Tony Blair's infamously now George Bush's poodle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. France comes to mind, and Israel. Those four countries in particular, but also other European countries. Why is it that they are?
Is it any sort of mystery that it also turns out to be like the richest countries that are kind of like at the top of the food chain when it comes to like economies, you know, largest economies and stuff like that? It's money, you know. I mean,
it's exercising an economic power, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, in a certain sense,
it's also about the countries with the largest number of psychopaths in power and in positions of control, because psychopaths have a kind of destructive impulse, a dominating, controlling, and destructive impulse, where they get their jollies from dominating and destroying other people. And if you're in a position of power in a major Western country, and you're like that, well, then the best way to get off in that sense is to send in the troops or send in the drones, or exercise that creepy need.
In a certain sense, the reason why I think that it's like that is because they're the countries with the most to lose. The populations have the most to lose because they have the most comfortable life. You see, they're less likely to make waves about it. So you know, when you have the good life, you know, you don't want to give it up. So you're not going to make any waves. You know, and that's again about this whole exercise of power. It's easier to have power for people who have things to lose than it is about people who are, you know, already starving and already don't have a job and already living on the street. You know, in large populations, it's much more difficult to manage them in the way Western powers are done. I mean, we wouldn't have the same kind of tyrannies there. You have to kind of have a military tyranny when you have lots of poor people.
I often hear that, you know, people say in the anti-war movement in the U.S., they'll argue that we need to stop these wars, if only because they're bankrupting us. They're bankrupting our economy.
Yeah.
Now, they say that on the one hand,
but they're not. There's a fine balance, you know.
There's also great profit to be made.
Well, there's only profit to be made. Apart from killing people, there's only profit to be made from war.
Money is, generally speaking, kind
another
of fake.
thing that touches on something you said, Jason, are the wars, are they necessary for for us in the West to sustain our relatively comfortable lifestyles.
Money is imaginary to begin with, right? So you can't go to the money thing because it's all kind of a bit of a joke anyway. It's all kind of a bit of a play. It's all this sort of stuff based on debt, moving numbers around, and it's all based on the faith that those things are worth something. So, I mean, I don't really think that in the end it's really, really about money.
Well, at the level of corporations, it would be about multinational corporations. It's about money. It's about getting access to raw materials for almost nothing.
In all fairness, no, it can't be even then, right? Because these people have so much money. They have an inconceivable amount of money. To be fair, most of these large corporations have such an inconceivable. We're talking about, like, Goldman Sachs has like trillions. Like they have more money than they could ever spend if they tried to buy like every Ferrari ever made in the history of the world and gold plate all of them. They still couldn't spend all of the money that they have, right? So, I mean, it can't be about money for them because they have so much money they couldn't run out of it if they tried to buy a Ferrari and gold plated every day.
That's the banks, though.
Yeah.
But at the level of the corporations, they still have...
Well, how much money does Monsanto have?
Well, Monsanto's pretty big, but there are other corporations involved that need raw materials around the world to produce products, and they want to produce as possible so they can enrich the CEO and all of the VPs and stuff. Right. But they're all being encouraged to do that. It's the banks ultimately interest. And sure, the banks don't. Money isn't a factor for the banks. For the banks, it's about control. It's ownership.
Right.
Ownership of.
But if it was really about money, then maintaining the economy and not bankrupting the living hell out of everything would be like kind of the point. You know, I mean, they might be just completely and totally incompetent, which is something that I lean towards.
We have a call here, so we're going to take this call.
Yeah.
Hi, caller. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Hi, my name is Silvio, and I wonder... Hello?
Silvio, can you turn your speakers down?
Yeah, we're getting feedback here.
Yes, hi.
Hey, Silvio. So what's your question?
I'm from Romania. I was wondering if they are going to Afghanistan and Iraq and all these countries, and they're saying that they're fighting on terrorism. Imagine if they would come, if they would come to USA and things, and you would be fighting with them.
You mean if the terrorists came to the USA? Oh, we just lost him.
Uh-oh. I didn't really understand what he was saying.
No. You can call back, Silvio, if you like. We didn't really...
Get him to post on the...
Yeah, or send it to the chat window. But, yeah, so it's about...
It's about respect.
It's about... control. Ultimately, it's about control of the resources, and even beyond that, the resources of the planet, and beyond that, it's about control of the population. I mean, I hesitate to kind of pop that, but it seems to me that that's the ultimate design, or the ultimate...
I don't think there is.
Ultimate result is that you have control psychologically over large numbers of people.
Right.
I mean, who wants that? Does somebody want that, or is that just a byproduct? And they go, yeah, we can control these people, but that's not really what we want. We just want all the goodies.
Yeah, but like the goodies only make sense when you have people who have them in a sense, when you have societies and when you have economies with levels of income and different jobs and stuff like that. I mean, having a bunch of poor people starving on the street is not really benefiting, is not necessary, right? I think in the end that the goal is actually just being evil and being mean.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is kind of just meanness. You know, it's just mean-spirited. And I mean mean in the very classical sense of the word, of being like the lowest possible kind of like spiritual, development in a person that makes them do these types of things. I think that the goal is eventually, I mean, the psychopaths in power, they're just mean people. Like they do it because it's fun for them and they're mean. It's not really in the end about money. It's not even really so much about control. Because there are easy ways to have. They already have control. They have plenty of control. They don't need any more control.
So it's about killing people.
Well, not just that. It's about torturing people. It's about hurting people. It's about pulling the wool over people's eyes. It's about sort of like tricking them over and over again. It's like it's like
and then
toying with someone before you kill them,
and snickering in your back room.
Like there was a video of how they treated Gaddafi or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Remember, right? That video, and then kind of like they tortured him. I think there was even a claim that they raped him or something like that.
Yeah.
And then like we're shooting him, and then they killed him, right? And that's what's fun for them. The most fun for them is not the kill; it's all the stuff leading up to it.
Well, they have that written down actually in the CIA book of how to overthrow a government or a dictator or a leader or whatever. Right. They're explicit about humiliating him publicly. Yeah, it's very in an effort to demoralize any of his supporters.
It's about demoralization too. You know, I mean that's what, and it basically makes you afraid. You know, I mean that was the whole release of the Abu Ghraib thing and all the waterboarding stuff. It was basically, you know, see what we do if you go against us type of thing.
This could be you.
This could be you type of stuff, you know? It's because it's meanness. It's meanness. I mean, you know, it's not kosher in my opinion, you know, from a statesman kind of point of view to do that kind of thing too.
It may well be kosher.
It's not. It's not okay. You know, I mean, that kind of behavior is really not okay.
It depends what you mean by kosher.
Yes, it depends what you mean.
Anyway, moving on. No, that was just a little dig at the Israelis. Because I was saying Israel, that kind of thing is kosher. Because they torture and humiliate Palestinians all the time, so it's technically kosher. Yeah. But
I mean, I think people should find that kind of behavior fundamentally unacceptable. You know, in any human being, it's just absolutely unacceptable.
Yeah, when you join the CIA, you get brought into that world, and you get brought along, and before you know it, you're doing it.
Yeah. And you're a bad person for doing it.
Yeah,
you know,
like you said before.
You're a bad person for doing it.
Everybody
and participating in it, even if you're just the guy that mans the door of the torture chamber. You know, you're just as responsible for what goes on in there because you open the door.
The sad thing is that there's so many human beings on this planet who otherwise would lead fairly normal, mundane, inoffensive lives, who, at a moment's notice, could find themselves in that position of being a bad person doing something like that.
Yeah, totally.
That's a major problem.
It is a major problem. The thing is I look at, like, you know, the human beings as kind of like a spectrum, right? There's like this left side of the spectrum that's all white colored, and those are like good people who, like, no matter what situation you put them in, they are never going to intentionally or even indirectly cause somebody hurt. You know, if you say open the door to the torture chamber, they're like, no, I'm not going to. And they're very few. And on the right side is like this bright, or this dark black side, and those people are very, very evil, right? Mm-hmm. And in the center is like gradations from left to right, from black to kind of like gray, and then from gray to white. You know, we're right in the center of the people who, in most situations, they wouldn't do something bad, but if really put under pressure and fear, they would, and, you know, getting better and getting worse. So it's kind of like this spectrum of very good people, medium to okay people, and then okay to really satanic, evil, hey, let's all sacrifice some babies, you know, type of thing.
So listen, where are you in that spectrum? Call in and let us know.
You know,
but it actually reminds me of what we talked about in previous shows about the Milgram experiment and the Stanford prison experiment, and that they came out more or less 50-50. Yeah. In the Milgram experiment, where people were meant to administer electric shocks to somebody they didn't know for getting an answer wrong, 50% of the people, more or less, went all the way to the potentially lethal shock.
Right.
And the other half balked at it and wouldn't do it.
Some of them wouldn't do it. Some of them had problems with it, and some of them had real problems with it but still did it, and some of them had some problems with it at a point, and then some of them didn't have any problems at all. You know, so it's a spectrum on our side, but the small core of the people, I mean, there's very few Hitlers and there's very few Gandhis, basically, the way that I look at the situation. And everyone in the middle is kind of malleable, and under the right circumstances, everybody has their price. You know, I mean, you know, if somebody, you know, holds a gun to your child, says, if you don't do X, I'll shoot your child, you'll probably do it, even if that thing is kind of horrible, you know. So everyone has their price in a certain sense. Some people don't. Like Gandhi didn't have a price.
Yeah.
But very, very few people don't have a price.
And that's what we're talking about in the war on terror. It's Western governments going around promoting people like that who don't have a problem with this kind of torture and abuse of other people. Don't have a problem with they're promoting those kind of people in power and leaving them there for a while, and then and then pointing at them as terrorists and going away the country, because that was the point all along.
Yeah.
But it's kind of interesting, because one thing I was reading there about Russians invading Afghanistan and that whole situation in the late 70s and early 80s were, as someone on our chat just mentioned, that Brzezinski said, give his blessing to these right-wing fundy Islamist nutjobs that the US were promoting. Zbigniew Brzezinski said, told them that your cause right, God is on your side. And that was in around 1980. And 20 years later, Brzezinski, still in power, is cheerleading an invasion to root out these same people who are now terrorists. God was on their side. God and right was on their side 20 years ago. Now they're terrorists, and we have to invade them to rid them.
You should expect nothing less from the government. You should expect nothing less from government and politicians. I mean, because they're liars. Everybody knows, right? And that's the thing that, in a certain sense, kind of galls me. Everybody knows that politicians are liars. But they only believe them. You only believe a politician when you're afraid and it's convenient. But most of the time, everyone just admits, yeah, they're lying to me. Yeah. But nobody does anything about it. You know, nobody knows what to do about it.
Yes, the whole communist threat at the time was a red herring. I mean, talking about Brzezinski, there was Brzezinski, surprise, Rumsfeld, Cheney was there, and Wolfowitz, and a few others.
People who have been in power in America for the last.
Well, those people at that time, they called them Team B. Team A was the CIA at the time, and the CIA was providing intelligence on the extent of the Soviet threat. Right. And they were basically saying that it wasn't such a real threat at all to American interests. But Team B, made up of these usual suspects, had a problem with this and told the CIA that they were totally misinterpreting this intelligence and that it was far worse than they were suggesting. So they were basically politicizing the intelligence, or using the intelligence for political gain and twisting it. And they did that at the time, and it led to the whole arms race during the 80s, and a massive build-up in spending for the military, and a massive expansion of CIA operations and covert US military operations around the world because they spun this Soviet threat. It wasn't really so bad at all. And they did exactly the same thing. Exactly the same people. Cheney, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz did exactly the same thing 20 years later, leading up to the Iraq War. As most people know, they did exactly the same thing in terms of they went to the CIA and said, and spun all of the intelligence. And they got really desperate because they started just pulling people, anybody they could find who would make up a story about how evil Saddam was and how he was connected to al-qaeda and how he had all these weapons. Anybody that would do that for a few bucks and sign their name at the bottom of the document, they pull them in and present them to the American public as here's evidence.
But then it kind of also presents a little bit of a problem, right? Because here these guys they're at the top of the food chain in America, and they couldn't be arsed to plant a single bomb. I mean, really, would it have been so hard to plant a bomb?
Who?
These people in charge who were telling all these lies.
Cheney and Wolfowitz.
They couldn't plant. I mean, the fact that they didn't find any weapons of mass destruction.
Oh, you mean plant one as in
It's very telling that they didn't find any when the big powers in America, just couldn't pay somebody to, hey, can you drop, a couple of sarin gas, things here?
Yeah.
And, they didn't even find residual stuff.
Yeah.
I mean,
I've thought about that, and I figured that it must have had something to do with traceability or not wanting to leave themselves exposed. They've weighed it up and said, listen, the chances of us being exposed in this are pretty high. How do we get one that's authentic?
That's strong evidence that there's no grand conspiracy.
Yeah.
Well, it's strong evidence that there's no unified conspiracy in the world, that it is basically a bunch of self-interested psychopathic leaders who are just basically in positions of power and are trying to do anything and everything they want. And, the American people let them get away with it, but they could be stopped any day, at any time, by, the American people simply, waking up and just not believing the lies anymore and saying so. I mean, that's really all you'd have to do.
Yeah. No grand conspiracy, but people conspire.
Sure.
There's a famous speech
You and I conspire all the time. We conspire about what we're going to have dinner. I mean, everybody conspires.
Right, but
this whole thing of, lifting up conspiracies to be something like, ooh, it's like when friends share the same interest, like, oh, let's watch some Ed Wood movies, and they talk about, let's next week have an Ed Wood movie-a-thon. That's a conspiracy to have that. If it turns out that you like molesting children and bombing small countries, which most of these pathrocrats do, then, yeah, they get together and they have conspiracies. Hey, let's go to Bangkok and, molest some children. Hey, let's go bomb this country. Hey, let's go kill this other person. That's what they do.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no difference. The only difference is the level of evil of what they do.
And for people who want to go further and think that there is a grand conspiracy or have some feeling that there is, then as we've said before now, the real conspiracy is psychopaths, how they got here, and if somebody put them here, if it was Mother Nature or aliens or whatever, however the psychopathic type became part of the human race or not. That's a grand conspiracy because they are the ones who are the kind of foot soldiers. If there is some overlord, then they are the foot soldiers of the overlord doing his work, but they just do it as a matter of their nature.
Right.
So you're not going to find any grand conspiracy in looking at what they do, like Jason just said. They just do it because that's who they are. They like bombing small countries and, abusing people. So
we spoke before about psychopaths being very uncreative, to say the least, where they seem to be programmed, and you can almost anticipate the reactions because they'll always
put
do
them in
the
charge
same
of
things.
a government. Put them in charge of like economy. What will they do?
Yeah, and the same things play out time and time again in history, right?
Every single time.
And that's because they all get together and they self-reference. For them, external reality doesn't really exist. It's you put a couple of psychopaths together, and if they all agree on something, then they'll use each other and even their own thoughts. If they think it, then it's true. It's objectively true, and that's why That's why we're seeing such crass attempts at deceiving people, because they're not very creative or imaginative, as you said, because of that. Because they don't seem to be able to think in abstract ways, and because to really carry off a very good conspiracy or deception, you need to really put yourself, or be able to put yourself in the minds of other people who you're trying to deceive and trying to, and they don't tend to be able to do that,
and
because they're so self-centered.
That's why they're successful, because they're so incapable of imagining the nature and reality of another person's mind. Their lies are so disproportionate to anything that a reasonable person would say, I need to tell in order to get this person to believe it, that they succeed just on that basic fact. It's kind of like the Hitler thing, the bigger the lie, the easier it is to believe.
Right.
And he observed this thing, but for them, they tell these huge lies because they're just so incapable of imagining any other reality than the one that exists in their head,
Yeah, and
like what you were saying.
a listener, Muxel, on the chat just said, paraphrasing Laura, she said, there need not be a conspiracy if interests converge.
Yeah, it's just unified self-interest and meanness. It just turns out that it takes a consistent series of forms.
Yeah. And another listener, Pashala, said, I am wondering if the powers that be are amusing themselves about us stupid people when they give peace prizes to guys like Obama and the French President Hollande or the EU itself, which they have done. Maybe they get a thrill out of such things.
It's duping delight. This has been something that's been observed in all kind of psychopathic individuals, that they actually have pleasurable sensations when they pull one over on you. That really gets them off. They delight in duping people.
And I would say there's some people who, to some extent, delight in being duped.
Yeah. Well,
depending on how they're being duped.
Is that like all the stuff like that article? I don't think it was written by a psychopath. I think it's an and thenner, like I was saying, the and then. And those people are like sycophantic authoritarians, right? It's like they worship the concept of a psychopath because to them it's like the ideal state, because they're so devoid of conscience and devoid of any sort of like compunction. They actually desire that state because they think, wow, it'd be really great. Oh yeah, what if I didn't have these pangs and responsibilities? What if I could just do whatever I wanted? They kind of worship that psychopathic thing, and so they try to emulate it, which is why it comes off so completely and totally, farcical and puerile.
Yeah. So, just for our listeners, if anybody wants to call in with a comment or a question, feel free on this topic or any other topic that springs to mind, because this topic obviously can lead off in different directions. So I just wanted to say that for anybody wondering about the war on terror, the war on Muslim terrorism, and whether there is a Muslim terror threat or not, there really isn't. The only threat that there has ever been is the threat of people power and ordinary people demanding kind of social justice from either for themselves or from a government, and trying to enforce that basically. And that's the threat that is perceived by the powers that be, is people power and people basically taking control of their own lives and their own countries, the places that they live in. Right. And the whole point of the war on terror and the Cold War previously was to use those two threats as a justification to go around the world and make sure that anywhere where that where there were people who were galvanizing and forming themselves groups or parties that were going to put this into place, put social justice into place in their countries, anywhere that was taking place, and the US or Western governments had strategic interests there, then they went there. They called those people terrorists or communists, and they destroyed them, and they overthrew a socialist government, like they've done in so many countries, and installed dictators. And in terms of the war on terror, in the late 70s, when there was a prime minister of Pakistan, not long after Pakistan had been created, actually, and he was basically this kind of guy who was going to have social justice and empower the people and have basically a decent country, fairly secular. He wasn't right-wing Islamist or anything like that. His name was Ali Bhutto, and the CIA went in and basically helped to overthrow him, staged a coup, and put a general in power, General Zia, who was a right-wing Islamist nut job, and billions of dollars to him and his government in Pakistan afterwards. And he set up a bunch of these madrasas in the tribal area of Pakistan and Afghanistan.
Like Curry Madras?
No, not Curry Madras. Right. But I'm sure they served it there. But
I love that.
But these were madrasas, basically schools, Islamic schools, and all of these schools were used to churn out as many, to basically radicalize in a fundamentalist Islamist kind of way, radicalize as many people as they could, and churn them out and make them the evidence for there being a fundy Islamist threat. And they also then controlled them and used them through proxy groups and stuff. The Western government, CIA and MI6 and other intelligence agencies used them and pushed them around different places, and they could manipulate them to stage some kind of an attack in any country, any area they wanted, to achieve their aims, and ultimately to call terrorists and attack or invade that country as they saw fit. And that is the basics of the war on terror and what it was, and the Cold War previously.
It was keeping people in a state of fear and keeping them away from each other. I mean, like this whole baby bomber thing, this is all like, they did this kind of stuff in the Vietnam War too. They had this whole, why are you bombing that, why are you bombing that village? It's like, oh, well, they throw their babies at us, and the women are armed and they're willing to blow them, that kind of stuff, It's the same sort of thing. It's just basically, but it's also making people afraid of going near anyone they don't know. I mean, I mean, right now after reading that article, if someone had been walking down the street and saw a baby lying, next to a trash can somewhere, they wouldn't have gone up to pick it up. They would have left it there and ran away and called the police. Mm-hmm. I mean, and that's what it does to people. It subverts their humanity in a certain sense to make them afraid of other people. They won't connect to it. And the real truth of the matter is the power of the people is not necessarily even in civil disobedience. It's not in revolution. It's not in free speech and all this stuff. The power of people is the ability to put aside differences between somebody else and just, forgive them for being different from you, forgive them for having different ideas than you, and just joining together for a common cause, being social, exercising the socialness of humanity. And everything about American society and Western society is all about honeycombing society so that none of them can become a large enough mass that they wouldn't be controllable, because there is enough people, good, normal, regular human people, that they couldn't shoot you all, they couldn't arrest you all, and even trying would just be pointless. And they know that. So what they have to do is they have to make people into little tiny groups and move them across. That's why when they go into countries, they set the most unpopular group of people, the meanest group of people in charge, so that everybody hates them, and now everybody's fighting. And they just, create this kind of infighting and division. It's divide and conquer.
Yeah.
You know?
Absolutely. And talking about the CIA, and you mentioned Vietnam, just getting back to how CIA people are, what do you call them? Evil?
Evil.
Just pure evil.
CIA, NSA, or evil.
There's one example of the kind of thing that was going on. This was 1958. There's a guy called Alan Lawrence Pope. He's a retired U.S. military and paramilitary aviator, and he joined the CIA flying their fake flying under their fake air transport companies.
Air America.
Air America. Well, at that time it was called the Civil Air Transport.
Right.
And it was a CIA front organization, and he was flying. It was all about fighting the communists and stuff. This was after the Korean War and just building up to the Vietnam War and the Americans' influence, taking over from the French, Indochina, basically Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Indonesia. And this guy basically flew around in an airplane bombing parts of Indonesia, towns and cities in Indonesia, and boats, all supposedly communist boats and stuff. But this was all, obviously the whole communist thing was a cover for the U.S., protecting its interests against people that would support it.
That's understandable, but they're just being mean.
Yeah, well, that's what they claimed it as. But so this guy flying around, he's a psycho because he basically bombed and killed bunches of people in his bombing runs for the CIA, and he was caught. Eventually, his plane was shot down, and he was captured by the Indonesian government at the time, and but the American ambassador intervened, and because he was condemned to death, which he should have been, but he was released and sent back to America, and he later said himself that I enjoyed killing communists, and he said they said Indonesia was a failure, but we knocked the shit out of them. We killed thousands of communists, even though half of them probably didn't even know what communism meant. Which is true. Probably the vast majority of people caught up in that Cold War conflict, and those Cold War conflicts did not know what communism meant. They were just basically people who were being manipulated, and a lot of them knew what they wanted, which was, as we talked about, social justice and things like that, an end to any kind of corrupt rulers and stuff. But they were all called communists by the Americans, and therefore they were slated for execution by napalm or large bombs, So,
well, this is it. The historical narrative says, or at least let's say a liberal historical narrative says that Vietnam was a failure. Says that the invasion and occupation of Iraq was a disaster, and so on and so on. But are they really from the point of view of the psychopaths doing this?
Who said it was? They're disasters of wars, but you have to understand that we haven't had a war in a very, very long time. I don't even know if necessarily. World War II was kind of a war, but all the rest of them were not really wars. They were, who knows what they were. They were about something weird, because the point wasn't to go in and win. The point was to go in and occupy territory and waste money and lives and all this different stuff. I mean, Sun Tzu 2,500 years ago said, do not go occupy a country. Either destroy it or, don't do anything with it. Basically, if you're not going to go there and destroy it, don't try to occupy it. It'll bankrupt your state. Basically, he said 2,500 years ago, if you occupy a country, your state will be bankrupted. What's going on in America right now? They're occupying 2 countries. Are they occupying more than 2 countries now?
It depends what your definition of occupation is, because
occupation is if you send soldiers to another country and they don't come home right away.
Since Obama came to power, they're doing that less and less. They're relying less on...
Are there American troops or
yes, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in several African countries.
Do they have a bed there?
Yeah, I mean,
where they're sleeping. And they don't just go there and then come back the next day.
No,
there are U.S. military bases in every single country.
No, in 121 countries.
Yeah, I mean it's
most countries.
Insane. Why
in terms of bases? Yeah, it's an empire, obviously.
Well, that's something I want to ask you. It's an empire, right? It's an American empire.
It's ostensibly yes, it's an American.
Psychopathic empire. We currently live under a psychopathic empire.
Yeah.
You can't call it an American empire, because when you say the word American, you're supposed to America is supposed to represent a couple of different ideals that are really kind of important. You know, basically freedom, democracy, power of the people, and this kind of like this whole send us you're cold, you're hungry, you're huddled back type of thing, right? And we'll eat them. And we'll eat them, you know. But now today, like you have people like this thing. I really hate Piers Morgan, right? I really hate this guy.
Who doesn't?
I mean, he's so offensive, right? But there's this movement of people who want to get him deported. Right?
Yeah,
and that's the most un-American idea I could ever. A person who says that can't really be considered American. I mean, this whole like, you know, let's strengthen the borders. That's an anti-American idea. Let's hold, you know, send us your cold, your huddled masses type of thing. You know, America is about some ideals. When the empire that we see today might call itself the American empire, but it's not. It doesn't represent American ideals. It doesn't represent freedom, democracy. Justice for the little guy, you know, even going back to the yeoman farmer type of thing, the Jeffersonian thing, you know, even though a lot of people might argue with that, I still think that that's really one of the core founding principles of America.
It's an empire that is currently managed out of a large chunk of land on the western side.
It used to be called America.
On the western side of the Atlantic. Is that?
It used to be America.
I mean, yeah. I mean, you can call it an American empire because basically the country's called America, and that's where it's managed from. That's where the seat of power, basically.
Name only.
But yeah, as far as Jason's saying, it's not. Depends what you mean by America, but.
So when
it's a psychopathic empire, basically.
Yeah, it's an empire of psychopaths. We're dealing with an empire of until we stop talking about England, France, and America and start talking about the psychopathic people who just are doing this shit, we're always going to have a problem of really understanding the situation because we think that there's this separation. We think that there's an American empire and we think that there's a French empire. We think that there's an English empire, but they're all ruled by psychopaths, and so it's a psychopathic empire. The fact that there's psychopathic factions is just sort of like a complexity.
And the psychopaths use the term themselves. The Project for the New American Century. This clique we were talking about earlier, Rumsfeld, Cheney, Wolfowitz, Pearl, they wrote this document, Rebuilding America's Defenses, in 1998, in which they encouraged, let's say, incoming U.S. policymakers to project American dominance over the entire world. They came up with this term, full-spectrum dominance.
Yeah.
They use the term empire.
Yeah.
So at the very least, they do project, they do want Americans kind of, in a subconscious way, to think of themselves as being at the head of an empire.
Maybe certain Americans in certain think tanks and things like that. But, yeah.
I mean, as long as they maintain forward momentum, it's gonna be okay. You know, with the U.S., as long as the machine's in motion, like it'll stay for a little while. You know, it's just like because it's so big, it kind of can't help but move a very long distance to all the little people. But what's going to happen in America is the same thing that happened to the Soviet Union. Is the minute they lose momentum, everything's going to fall apart from all the rotting internal corruption. I mean, there was no revolution in Russia to get rid of communism. It just basically fell apart. Same kind of thing will probably happen to China as well. You know, I mean, they have all this expansion, they have all this growth, and so that's keeping things going. But eventually, you know, they'll ascend. America will descend. It will fall apart because of all the rampant corruption that people put up with. All these corrupt, psychopathic politicians, it's going to fall down. It will collapse. Then, you know, probably China will come up, and then it will do the same thing because people, they don't learn, you know?
Well, in talking about this, there's a big new Brzezinski guy again.
Who is this guy?
He was the national security advisor to Carter. He's basically
Eminence Grise.
He's a kind of an Eminence Grise.
He's like a Cardinal Richelieu.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and he, you know, thinks himself as a bit of an intellectual. He's written a few books.
He's a Russian Kissinger type of character.
Yeah.
For the conspiracy theorists out there, he's a Bilderberger. He founded the Trilateral Commission.
He did found the Trilateral Commission, yeah. He wrote a book in 1998 called The Grand Chessboard.
Right.
And just on what you were just saying there about how ultimately America can't sustain itself as an empire in that way. He, in his book, The Grand Chessboard, he said on page 35 that never before has a populist democracy attained international supremacy. That's America, the populist democracy, attaining international supremacy. And he says, but the pursuit of power is not a goal that commands popular passion, i.e., the American government can't run around saying we're just after power and expect people to support them. But he says, except in conditions of a sudden threat or challenge to the public sense of domestic well-being, like 9/11, for example.
Ooh.
He says the economic self-denial, that is, defense spending, and the human sacrifice involved, which is casualties, even among professional soldiers, required in the effort, are uncongenial to democratic instincts. Basically saying you can't have an empire if you want to have a fully fledged democracy as well. He says democracy is inimical to imperial mobilization.
Totally.
Which is true, but he doesn't seem to give a shit about it.
Well, the thing is the answer to this problem is for democratic people to kind of compromise a little bit on this, you know? I mean, to stop being such peaceness about everything, to stop being so guileless. Basically, the problem is that good people have no guile whatsoever. They shun it completely. They have no cunning and no artifice, and they don't expect cunning and artifice from politicians and bad people in power, and that's why they keep... And they die by droves, you know. They're starving to death. They're dying by, you know, sicknesses. I mean, most Americans now have like 3 chronic illnesses that they're taking medication for. It's absolutely insane, you know. I mean, the state of health in America is horrible. The state of jobs is horrible. The state of the economy, everything is horrible. And it's going to continue to be horrible until, you know, good people who are, you know, just want things to be nice can develop a little bit of cunning and artifice and not be so completely and totally believing everything. They just believe everything that they're fed. They're not really bad people. They just accept the lies, and they don't expect that someone's going to lie to them. And just start expecting it. Just change a little bit.
We've got a call here, so we're going to go ahead and take it.
Hello.
Hi. Caller,
hello. Can you hear me?
Hello. Yep.
Hello.
Hi, what's your name?
Betsy.
Hi, Betsy.
Hey, Betsy.
How you doing?
Pretty good.
Welcome back.
How you doing?
I'm doing well, enjoying the radio program.
All right. What you got?
I just noticed when y'all were talking earlier about how far back this goes, you mentioned maybe, 100 years or whatever. To me, this whole nation is founded on the same terroristic principles. I mean, first it was the Indians. Then we moved on to Japanese or blacks, Japanese, whatever. America has always been controlled by fear since day one. Consumerism requires constant expansion. An empire requires constant expansion or it collapses. So there's nothing new.
But there's only so much of the earth to conquer.
Well, yeah. Well, I'm sure then we'll find other planets to ruin.
Other planets?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much. The next thing you know, they're going to be fighting over the moon. I mean, I wouldn't put it past these people to fight over the moon.
They're talking about mining asteroids.
Oh, that's
right,
mineral.
Right. Earth first, then we'll destroy somebody else's planet.
Yeah, I mean, this is what happens when you. I mean, because psychopathic individuals, they're like, they're like generative cancer cells. You get some cancer in there. If you don't cut it out, it's going to take over the whole body. And I mean, if they're trapped on the planet Earth, eventually it will eat itself out. But if they have an escape, like, let's go fight over the moon, then it'll last a little bit longer. But generally, I mean, empires do have to maintain forward momentum. They have to keep expanding, and eventually it runs out when they can't do it anymore, and everything collapses. And then everyone's like, oh, why is it so terrible? We're starving and cold. And then you're like, well, explain to you some of the basics of life here. Really? You let psychopaths take over and run things, regardless of the fact that they're not specifically hurting you today, they will be hurting you in the future. Even if they don't shoot you, eventually they're going to ruin your economy and your government, and then you're going to be starving to death in the cold, and you're not going to be able to do anything about it. And you're going to be saying, why did this happen to me again? Because it's been happening over and over again for the last 10,000 years. Stuff like this happened in every single culture throughout history. The Assyrians, the Romans, the Egyptians, all of these people, they let psychopathic priestly people or politicians, whatever you want to call them, you change the name, whatever it is, you let them take over, you let them rule, you let them make decisions, and you don't watch them every single minute They'll check everything you do, verify all facts of all the things that they say to you, and then they run your economy and your culture and everything into the ground, and then everybody's, screwed.
Would you notice that in those previous empires, like the Roman Empire and other empires, they kind of collapsed, but only in on themselves and in a specific area.
Yeah,
But the problem today is that our world is so small, and the ability for an empire to expand around the globe and take over the entire globe tends to suggest that there's a collapse is going to be global.
Mm-hmm.
But they have a tremendous advantage. They have a huge advantage over the rest of us, and that is that they don't care if they kill. I mean, that's why they succeed. That's why they are allowed to take over. They have no compunctions against killing an opponent. Somebody that may be able to bring them down or expose them, kill them. We don't do that. We can't do that.
Yeah.
Normal people can't live with that. So, that gives them a real advantage when it comes to taking over society in general. Kill the opposition. We can't do that. I mean, we vastly outnumber them. If we were killers, they wouldn't be here.
Yeah.
But if we were killers, we would end up probably being like them in a certain sense. I mean, to a certain degree.
Exactly. That's the advantage they have. That's why they succeed.
But it's not necessarily an advantage, right? Because the reason that it's not an advantage, they do succeed in quick battles, right? They will succeed in like small stuff. But over time, they're going to die just as much as everybody else. They're going to start.
Well, they ain't done it in 10,000 years.
What? Oh yeah.
They haven't died off in 10,000 years. I mean, as a species, the ability to kill really gives them evolutionary advantage. They're on top because they're vicious.
Yeah, they just keep coming back.
Well, it is kind of a Ragnar Redbeard kind of mind makes right type of philosophy. There's a certain level of truth to it. But it works because people allow it to work. People do. You allow it to work because you make choices for yourself, and that's how they get you. Your self-interest ends up getting you. People, they want their TV, they want their house, they want their 2.5 kids, they want their SUV, they want their comfortable life, and they're willing to pay for it. Not just money, they're willing to pay in their freedoms. And as long as they're willing to make choices based on their self-interest of, I want the comfortable life, I don't want to be disturbed with this. That's what they say to themselves. It's not my concern, right? It's going to end up being their concern. It's going to end up being that they're fooling themselves by saying that it's not my concern. But right now they say it's not my concern, and that's the doorway for psychopaths to get things by you. It's like that old saying that all that's necessary for evil to succeed is for good men to do nothing, and that is truth. If every single good person did one thing, just one thing, post one message on one blog saying, "Hey, this is some bullshit," it would drown them out. If they all got into one area and just lit up some campfires, the smoke would cover all of America. I mean, seriously. But they don't do it. They don't do anything. As long as you don't do anything, this is what's going to happen to you. Your society is going to eventually collapse. It's going to be like Rome. It's going to be like Russia. It's going to be like any of these other types of empires that they kind of disappear in a certain sense. Things just start to fall apart, and then everything falls apart, and then suddenly nobody's got food, and millions of people die, and there's no medical care, there's no all this different stuff. That's where it's going to go because you let psychopaths rule, and eventually. I think it's going to take another 10,000 years, to be honest, for people to learn this particular lesson. I think people are very slow learning. Another 10,000 years of allowing psychopaths to run governments because they're so charismatic and they're so strong and they can do all those dirty things that you don't want to do. They can go kill people when they need to kill people. You don't have to get your hands dirty. And then everything falls apart, and you're all like, oh, wow, why, God, why did you do this to me, and stuff like that. And eventually people will get it. I have faith. Eventually people will get it. I think it'll take them.
I don't know. Every time somebody pops up is just as charismatic that could, teach people, wake people up, make a difference, and get the populace going in the opposite direction. So that kills them. It's just that easy.
But what's
Kennedy.
really
Look at Kennedy.
Yeah, but look at Kennedy in a certain sense that people are really kind of very petty, right? And the weakness of people is not so much that they kill, the person who pops up. It's that they defame them, right? I mean, you've noticed this works so well with people because they're so internally puritanical and duplicitous about this type of stuff, that people who actually do good things just get defamed with, you know, one thing or another, right? And people believe it, that they're jealous and hateful of people. So actually, it's not so much that they go around killing every good person. As a general rule, they don't. What they do is they just defame them. They send a group of defamers against them, and that kind of ends up working. And, you know, people, you know, they'll learn eventually.
And then there are those people who do lead by example.
Right.
Bradley Manning comes to mind in the U.S.
Nah, he's a tool.
And he's totally vilified.
He's a tool.
Do you reckon he's a tool?
All right.
Oh, sure, we're all tools in the big game, though, right, Jay?
What?
I mean, everyone plays their part, but
what do you
who's
think
pulling the strings?
What do you think, Bradley Manning, Betsy?
I think he was a young man with conscience, and a young man with conscience in the military is going to wind up getting hurt.
Yeah.
I think he did exactly what they said he did, or what he's saying he did, is pull off a bunch of, you know, what was not really considered highly classified stuff. Private had access to it, and disseminate it. So I admire him a great deal. I think he should have I think what he did was absolutely commendable. The mistake he made was, you know, chatting and talking about what he'd done to an ARC. You know, if he had done what he, you know, released the information and kept his mouth shut, he'd still be wondering which private did it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but they're trying to make it.
He only got caught because he went on to a chat message board and talked with this guy Lamo, who has been looking for a chance to narc somebody out since the last time he did it. Mm-hmm. So, you know, he's in prison because he talked to a snitch. You know, if there's a lesson in this, if there's another private out there that has good information that they want to get out to the people, do it. You know, keep your mouth shut. You know, don't go talking to people in the chat group about it. Don't say I released this information on Facebook. They don't have evidence against Bradley Manning because of anyone of the information that was published. They had no idea where it came from until he read it out.
Mm-hmm. It's a real shame. I mean, he was, 21 at the time?
Yeah, he's a baby. He wanted somebody to talk to.
That's the hard way there.
Yeah.
Well,
he's just a young man. He had a guilty conscience. He thought he was talking to a friend, and then he's probably going to spend the rest of his life in prison.
Yeah. They're making an example of him to try and make sure no one...
And the example is, you know, when you do something like this, it will take a lot of low-level people, you know, and just cogs in the machine who say, this is right, and make it public. After you do it, keep your mouth shut. Don't tell anybody. Majority of people in this country are convicted of crimes because of their own mouths.
Yeah.
You know, very seldom are they actually convicted on evidence.
Yeah.
I think, on the other hand, it takes a case like this for people of conscience to realize just how careful you got to be, how strategic you got to be.
Cunning, and you have
look at what you're up against. You're up against psychopaths. This is not, you know, what you might have thought of been before.
No.
People learn the hard way how to live with it.
WikiLeaks has instructions on their website of how to do a completely anonymous drop, down to the fact that CD burners are numbered, get one from a thrift store, burn your DVD, put it in a mailbox that's not under some remote mailbox somewhere that's, you know, not under video surveillance. I mean, if you follow those instructions, you know, even the people that received information wouldn't possibly know where it came from. And that's really the only way to do something anonymously, is that the people that you give the information to can't even know where it came from. Because anybody can be made to talk. The only way to do it is through complete anonymity. And he didn't do that. And I feel so sorry for him, but he didn't.
Yeah. All right, Betsy. Thanks for your call.
Good talking to you.
For the radio show.
All right.
All right. Take it easy.
Have a good night.
So right now we're going to go to a little commercial break, and we'll be back in less than 2 minutes.
Since ancient times, great civilizations have risen and fallen. The biblical plagues and the collapse of the Old Kingdom of Egypt, the plague of Justinian and the collapse of the Roman Empire, the Black Death that devastated Europe. Could similar catastrophes strike our planet again? Laura Knight Yadchik's latest book, Comets and the Horns of Moses, provides compelling evidence that the course of human history has been defined by extraordinary and devastating cosmic events. Drawing on her extensive study of history, religion, psychology, and physics, Laura uncovers clues hidden in the great myths, ancient astronomy, and the works of the Greek philosophers to unveil the secret knowledge of the ages: cyclical cosmic catastrophe, the periodical return of an extraterrestrial threat whose power moved mountains, reduced magnificent cities of old to rubble, and left the most powerful emperors trembling in fear. Comets and the Horns of Moses is a groundbreaking work that sheds light on our dark ages to reveal a timely warning to humanity. The clock is running down on our civilization. Comets and the Horns of Moses, available now for purchase from all Amazon websites.
And we're back. That was a little advertisement for Laura's new book, Comets and the Horns of Moses. We discussed that topic on a couple of occasions in past shows, and it definitely does shed light on the past, on some very dark chapters of our past history. That's what we're trying to do here today, although we're trying to shed a little bit of light on chapters of our more recent history.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, we've been talking about revolution and form it has taken in history, what form it's taking now, should people rise up. We talked about a revolution of the mind. Then a couple of years ago, we had the Arab Spring that broke out in Northern Africa. I think it was Tunisia first. Spread to Egypt, where it really took hold. And it's ongoing. I mean, in the Middle East. It's kind of hard not to notice that there's a lot of manipulation going on as well. And something I've been wondering is, to what extent is it a revolution in the sense of a genuine uprising, a reaction of people, and to what extent is it manipulated? Because we know that the CIA, amongst other bodies, have the so-called color revolutions.
Yeah. Well, it's not. They're not. The two ideas aren't mutually exclusive in the sense that you can have a local revolution or an uprising or people clamoring for social justice. That happens repeatedly and naturally in countries where such social justice doesn't exist. And we've already talked about that in the sense of that's what the whole communist threat and now terrorism threat is used. Those two threats are used as a cover for going into countries where you have these kind of this kind of clamoring for social justice, and to present them as essentially today a terrorist.
Yeah.
That it's a terrorist uprising, or that there are terrorists involved. And you notice that Libya, originally Libya, there was the Arab Spring had spread to Libya, but Libya was bombed, or the Arab Spring had already begun by the time Libya was bombed by NATO. And you notice that there's Muslim terrorist activity now, and has been since that bombing. There has been terrorist attacks, like the attack on the American embassy and stuff. It's all been spun into the terrorists that are now basically the whole Arab Spring kind of thing, with the exception of Egypt. Maybe it's been tainted by claims of terrorist or al-qaeda involvement.
The thing is,
so they're trying to subvert any genuine popular uprising and turn it into a terrorist uprising that the Western forces then need to go in and deal with. So they subvert it in that way.
The thing is, like, in the best case scenario, right? You look at what the government's doing. Like, let's say you believe everything that they say about what they're doing. All right, so let's just work from that. If you do, then they are the most incompetent people on the face of the planet. Because didn't we go into Libya to fix all these problems, and now we got terrorism there? It's like everywhere America seems to go, this terrorism suddenly pops up.
Yeah.
I mean, these guys are so... if we believe what they say, then they've got to be incompetent. If we don't believe what they say, well, then they're liars and they're cheats and they're dishonest and they're murdering people. If we do, they're just they're like the Gomer Piles of generals going on over here. Well, yuck, yuck, yuck. We went there with the best of intentions, but... stuff got messed up. It's like, come on, dude, seriously. I mean, even if you believe what they say, you should get rid of them on the grounds that they're incompetent. It's like nobody should want, the U.S. government to continue doing what it's doing the way it's doing it. The people who believe it should look at them and say, hey, you're incompetent. The people who don't believe it say, hey, you're lying, cheating bastards, and you're killing people. But either way, they need to go.
Yeah, I think they actually want revolution.
They must.
The powers that be want revolution. They want a global revolution or a revolution in successive countries. And that whole idea of revolution comes from communism, the original idea of
revolution.
Trotskyist kind of like communist revolution of the globe, and to install an agrarian proletariat who was control of all the means of production and control of all the resources of the country and stuff. Of course, they're nice ideals and people naturally flock to those ideals. But then you just end up with a corrupt elite controlling it and screwing people over. So, but then the other countries fight against all that local population that are flocking to that ideal as the enemy and bomb the crap out of them. You know what I mean? So, you have this global elite. There's no difference between the elite communists of the day and the elite Western leaders of the day. They're both elites and they both kill their own people.
Was that like what Boris said? Poor people got more in common with with black people than they do with rich people, type of thing. Poor people everywhere have something in common together. You have nothing in common with the elites of the population. Your rulers, you have nothing in common. You have no common ground. They have more money than you will ever see in your entire life. Mm-hmm. They live a lifestyle that you can never live. They make decisions that you would never be able to make, that you would never have the power to make, and that no person should actually have the power to make, and they only accidentally do because you've been sitting along playing Angry Birds all day and sitting on your Facebook with Farmville. You've been too busy with those other important shit.
Yeah.
You have nothing in common with the elites, and you shouldn't feel. People sit there and say like, "Oh, we kind of need them." It's like, yeah, well, maybe, but maybe not.
No, you don't.
About it, you don't really need them.
Everything that goes on in a country is produced. All of the workings of a country is produced by the ordinary people.
Right.
And it's made to work by the ordinary people. Think about it. In your country, what keeps the country running? It's ordinary people working ordinary jobs. And the elite up there and try to pretend that they're in some way, indispensable to that process because people wouldn't know how to raise cows or keep a farm or dig holes in the road and repair roads without elites who don't know how to do it themselves.
Seriously, it's ridiculous. The thing is, societies exist based on something that really isn't kind of true. It's like a universally accepted lie. It's a social contract. It's a faith in an organization, a grouping of people, right? You agree that money has value. You agree that a position gives a person the power to make decisions. You agree that a judge has the right. You agree to all these things. These are contracts that the entire society implicitly or explicitly makes with each member that you agree to. All right? You could people could, if they really wanted to. If all the people, or a large majority of people got together, they could just agree to say, you know what, turns out that we don't need a president. From now on, we'll have a magic 8-ball set on an altar. And every time we need a decision, we will shake that 8-ball, and that will be what happens. Yeah. And you would probably actually end up getting a better society. You can agree. You can set a society. You don't have to have a democracy. You don't have to have a totalitarian government. You don't have to have fascism. You don't have to have communism. You don't have to have any of these prefabricated structures. You can create one ad hoc. And as long as you get people to agree that it's going to function, it will function. Because the thing is the guy who takes out garbage and the guy who runs the machine that flattens out the road, and the guy who flips the switch to turn on the electricity or to turn off the electricity or refuels the tanks or whatever, those people, they don't need a president or they don't need any kind of established elites to tell them, like Joe was saying, to tell them to do their job or how to do their job. They do it because we've all agreed that this is society should run, and we don't realize that we can change our minds at any point, and we could restructure society if we wanted to. But people won't. But they could, And they should recognize that you have more control over the way society runs than you think. And it's not about voting, right? Because voting is a system that society agreed on would be the way of doing this. And of course, now it's gotten polluted, but you could change that. You know, you can change stuff by getting people to put aside their differences, by having this thing that I've talked about, this revolution of the mind, changing the way you think about it, changing the way you think about yourself and other people, putting aside your differences, and understanding that people actually have more of a unified cause than they really think. Like, here's a great example. Right? There's a group of transsexuals, right? And they're marching against the government because they want to change some sort of establishment. There's a group of gay people, and they're marching against the government to get gay marriage. And then there's women who want, rights for women, and then there's blacks who want rights for blacks, and there's poor people who want more health care. And none of these people come together and support each other, but they all have exactly the same abstract goal. That is, they want to change the government, right? That's what they want. Each and every one. The fact that one of them wants to change for gay marriage and perhaps another group wants to change it against gay marriage is kind of irrelevant in a certain sense. Like, a person who doesn't want gay marriage should help the people who do want gay marriage on the basis of the fact that they should want it to be proved true that the government can be changed.
Okay.
Basically that. Unless somebody has a completely, in that particular example, it's diametrically opposed. Unless somebody has a completely diametrically opposed opinion to you, you should help them out. If people in society were to get together and say, you know what, I'm not really interested in your cause. You know what, I'm going to show up to your demonstration just because I support the whole idea that you're trying to change the government, and I want the government to change. Once the change ball starts rolling, then things can happen. But until the government starts changing based on the voice of the people, nothing's going to happen. And that's what you have today. You have all these different groups who are sort of marching for some kind of things. We want to control the bankers. We want to control the corporate spending here. We want to control the rights for marriage. We want to control these different things. These people just need to get together and say, you know what, your cause really isn't my cause, but I'm going to help you anyway. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think we have seen some of that in the West, in the Occupy movement, not just in the U.S. We saw that in Egypt. I mean, people were getting together en masse and discussing and talking about things.
Yeah. But that's seen as a threat immediately to the elite, and they don't like that kind of thing. It is a threat to them, and at least that's one thing they're clear on, that they're very perceptive of a threat to their own positions. And it always comes from people.
The problem is the logical conclusion of every conversation that a whole group of people would have over a long period of time is that we don't need them. That's the ultimate conclusion of it. If a whole bunch of people come together and started talking about it, start trying to solve problems, right? And eventually they would come to the problem of, well, why don't we just get rid of the elite, and then we won't have this 50 other problems that we've all been arguing against because they're actually caused by them.
And I think that they're innately aware of the threat, the powers that be, because they respond. We're talking about the Muslim terror threat, but the language has actually changed, especially since Obama came to power. Terrorism is now a far wider concept. Right? That's why there are headlines like "Oil Terror Plot Connected to Occupy Wall Street Movement" and the threat of domestic terrorism.
Yeah, that should give people a real pointer to what the whole terror threat, beginning with the commies, then going to Muslim terrorism, what the whole point was to instill in people the acceptance, or get people to accept the idea that the government has to take measures against threats from wherever, so that then they can apply it to the only threat that really exists for them, which is threat from the people. It has always been about the people, and it was always going to be turned on the ordinary people of the country, of the US, of Europe, or wherever. These policies were always directed at you because there never was a Muslim terror threat. There were no Muslims to prosecute this war on terror against. All designed to create the infrastructure of essentially a police state and putting more and more power in the hands of the elite so that they could use it against the people.
Well, what is terrorism? I mean, if you get right down to it, terrorism is when a person decides to use violence against established authority. That's what terrorism is. I mean, that's not what the word should mean, right? That's not what the word should mean. The word should mean it's somebody who uses terror to coerce, right? That's really not what they mean when they say a terrorist. They've changed the kind of meaning as a person who basically takes up arms against the government, but is not large enough in numbers to be considered a revolution or a civil war, right? It's basically if you have 1 to 10 people decide to like go bomb some sort of government facility, they're terrorists. Now, if 10,000 people decide to do it, that's a revolution, you know? So that's basically all it is. A terrorist is somebody who's against them, period. That's what terrorism is. Terrorism is anyone against the government. And they are trying to change that definition in the people's minds. They're changing the wording, changing everything, crowding it around, because basically what it is and what they're going to do is if you do not like the way things are, then you will be, by definition, that they have created, a terrorist, period. You are going to be a terrorist if you don't agree.
Terrorism is flexible, depending on the context.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, freedom fighters and rebels in Libya, but in Syria, they're terrorists.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I got that right. They're freedom fighters there as well. The terrorist there is the government.
It changes from day to day.
it flips, you know. It's all they call them whatever they want to call them based on if it serves the American government's needs, they're freedom fighters. If it doesn't serve what the American government wants or doesn't represent their policies, then they're terrorists.
Yeah, whatever works.
You know, whatever they want. They call it anything they want.
They call them Smurfs.
Yeah.
If it suited their purposes, they'd call them Smurfs.
The crazy thing is, as such, never existed. Nowadays, we see it all the time. You get photographs of Syrian, they're rebels now. These aren't al-Qaeda terrorists. These are rebels posing with the al-Qaeda flag, which I guess at some point was created since 9/11, and identifying with the ideology that never actually existed but has been brought into existence. And it is drawing radicalized Muslims whose homes have been bombed, countering the non-existent threat on terrorism.
You wonder if they're going to create their own Frankenstein. You wonder if they're going to create their own Frankenstein. If they actually are going to radicalize the Muslim world, because the Muslims are finally going to get tired of being the whipping boy and the scapegoat of the Americans. They're going to radicalize Muslims, and they're going to say, you know what? Maybe we don't believe in all this fundamental Islam stuff, but you know what? We're still going to strap bombs to our chest, type of thing. You know, I mean. They could end up creating the terrorism.
Well, yeah, absolutely, but that suits their agenda, because then they've created a fact on the ground. They've created the reality that they claimed existed beforehand by going around bombing and killing innocent people, claiming they're Muslim terrorists. And so then the people who are still left alive say, "Well, yeah, I'm kind of annoyed, so I want to terrorize you back." So now they've created Muslim terrorists, and
the thing is they go too far. They always go too far. You back somebody in a corner. Treat them like a rat. Trust me, man.
But it's a testimony to just how reluctant people are.
It is.
To fight back and to use any kind of violent tactics, because people have been pushed so far, especially in Arab and Muslim countries, have been pushed so far, and so few of them have done anything in response, have taken any action in response, because they don't. I mean, it's not natural to human beings, but it's natural to psychopaths.
Here's the proof of that, right?
To attack people.
In Russia, what happened? People wanted bread and freedom, right? They put the bread first because they were really hungry. They did all this marching. They overthrew all this stuff, right? They put these dudes in charge. And then how many of them starved to death? 40 million, right? How long did communism last? It didn't work. You know, it wasn't working. People were still starving everywhere, but they just laid down and took it. It's like the transmarginal inhibition, the Pavlov's dogs. You know, they put the dog in the cage and they electrocute the left side of the cage, and so the dog jumps up and goes to the right side of the cage. And they electrocute the right side of the cage, and the dog jumps up and goes to the left side of the cage. And then they keep doing this for a while, and the dog keeps really getting irritated by this. And then they decide, you know what? We'll electrocute the entire bottom of the cage. And then the dog freaks out. Oh, I can't do it.
The dog doesn't know what to do. It just sits there.
Doesn't know what to do, right? But then
passive.
It can't go back and forth. And so then it just lies down and accepts the shock because, you know what? There's nothing it can do anymore. And that's how people are. They just accept the way they accept things the way they are because they don't believe they can change them, and that's a lie. You can, absolutely.
We got a call here. We're going to take this call.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. What's your name and where are you calling from?
This is Lynn from Canada.
Lynn from Canada. Hi.
Hi.
Hi. I just wanted to address something that was a little further back that Jason was talking about. That, you know, if one person just does one thing, I think that we could probably get them right where they live just in terms of what we spend money on. You know, you take your money out of big banks, you don't shop with big corporations, you buy local, you don't buy processed crap. You just basically don't feed them.
And you have to be
aware.
Because you've seen what they've tried to do. They've tried to corner that. They've tried to make that not. But what they've done is they've started creating these large, basically corporate entities like this fair trade label and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I looked at, and this is like a huge corporate thing. It's like all of a sudden I was thinking that when I was buying fair trade that I was doing something good, and then I saw the organization behind it, and I was like, hold on a second. This is practically like buying from Coca-Cola. So, I mean, when it comes down to like buying locally, it's, you're probably best off finding a farmer who actually like grew on his farm or, something like that when you're buying locally. Don't be fooled by locally grown labels because, as it turns out, companies are not really obligated to tell you the truth on their labels most of the time. They can say it's bio and it's not really. They can say it's non-GMO and it's not really. They can say that it's locally grown and it's not. It's like, what was that? I think it was like Ford or something had the Made in America, or one of the car companies did, and like only part was actually made in America.
Yeah. No, I understand that, and that is exactly what I mean. I go to a local butcher and I say, where do you get your eggs from? Where do you get your meat from? And he can tell me exactly who, and they're like 20 miles out of town. The only barrier to that I can see is when people are asked to, give up things that they can't get locally. We're so spoiled with, having, cherries from Peru in December. It's ridiculous. But that really, to me, is the one way you can do it, and it's not going to get you labeled a terrorist and a rebel. It's just you very quietly conducting your life.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, it's probably one of the best decisions anybody can make. Is basically what you're saying. Is to stop feeding the machine.
Mm-hmm.
Just don't feed it. I mean, if you can't actually do something to help specifically, right?
Right.
Don't think to
make
hurt,
it worse.
To make it worse. Feeding the machine, every time you buy Coca-Cola, you are feeding into that sort of
corporate machine. Yeah.
Every time you buy GMO foods, you are, you're accepting them. You can't. And that's the thing. That's the price that people have. Okay.
Oh, absolutely, and that's why I think that one of the things that SOTT does is they've really given a lot of airtime or page time to things like the paleo diet, which do practically, if you want to do it properly, you need to go this route, because if you want to have really nutritious food, which has the lovely side effect of helping you think straight, who knew?
All right, we got another. What? No. Oh no, we don't. They dropped off. Anyway, what I was going to say on the paleo diet is actually kind of awesome because probably the biggest staple of the diet, as we've discovered, is the kind of the black broth. We're kind of big on this whole, the
bone broth.
Yeah, the bone broth, right? But there's a story it comes out of, who is it, Plutarch, when he's talking about Lycurgus, the founder of Sparta, and how all of the old people ate the black broth. This called it, right? And it was basically they left all the meat for the young people, and they just ate the broth that the meats and the bones were cooked in. And it turns out that is like a very good way to get nutrients, is to make like bone broth and put a little bit of meat in it.
And
it's very affordable because it's
Yeah.
dirt, So if you're poor and you're saying, like, where am I going to get, nutritious food from? It turns out that the stuff that nobody wants to buy, which is a couple of chunks of fat and some bones, is probably one of the best things that you can eat. So, yeah, the paleo diet is awesome, and it's more economical. You think that it wouldn't be, but it turns out it's way more economical.
Absolutely. And again, it's a double whammy. You're helping yourself and you're helping the cause with, very little effort and for people who are worried about it, very little, danger. If that's, I know some people who are really paranoid, like, if I go to this site, will I be tracked? And it's like, you already are. But anyway.
Yeah.
So it's a way of accomplishing these goals in a very... Pardon?
That aren't important. I said people worry about the things that aren't really important because, you can't really do anything about the website tracking and stuff like that. There's not really anything that you're going to be able to do about that.
Mm-hmm,
but you can
exactly.
do something about not buying Coca-Cola or, not choosing, choose not to drive somewhere, choose not to watch the television, choose not to buy this or buy that, choose to buy, regular clothes for regular people instead of buying something with a stupid brand on it,
Exactly.
I mean, You make those choices, and don't buy into the consumerist culture. You'd be surprised that you have a lot more time to do other things that are important, like maybe learn a new language. Listen to the show, read that book that you've been promising to yourself, things like that.
Pardon?
So yeah. What?
I missed that last thing.
He was just saying that people have a lot more time to read that book that they've been waiting to read and stuff like that.
Exactly.
Write that novel or
make that post.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's all I wanted to say is that it's not this great onerous I can't change the world sort of thing. There's things you can do every day.
Yeah.
Just one thing. I mean, if every person did just one thing every day, one small thing, say no. When you're watching the news, just say out loud, I don't believe that. Seriously, you'd be surprised how much power that would have when 100 million people are sitting there watching the news and all of them say at one time, I don't believe that, or horse shit. It's like thunder. It's like thunder to the gods. It's like a prayer that will let them know that they don't need to destroy you. They don't need to send the arrow of Zeus or whatever it is.
Yeah. Anyway, great show, guys. Carry on.
Thanks, Lynn.
Thanks, Lynn.
You're welcome. Okay. Bye.
Bye.
She's giving me an idea for a show.
What?
Carbs and addictions and feeding the machine.
Yeah, that would be a show. We might.
Well, the thing that always struck me about that whole situation is basically there's really no such thing as an essential carb, right?
Right.
You don't need it, right? There are people actually in the world, like the Inuits, they live in really cold climate. They grow vegetables.
Yeah.
You will die if you don't eat fat, basically. Like that's basically a fact. All vegetarians are always on a quest to find some sort of non-animal source of fat, and most of them give up and they eat fish or something like that because fish has really great fat, right?
Right.
A vegetarian that eats fish, in my opinion, has really sold.
And conversely, they eat vegetable fats that have been hydrogenated.
Yeah.
And that will kill you.
That will kill you eventually. But they're always on. So, there's this kind of like this mental duplicity, this cognitive dissonance going on because basically you will die without fat, but you will not die if you never eat a vegetable again for the rest of your life. But I don't eat vegetables, right? And when I tell people that, they look at me like, but you'll die. And it's like, actually, it's the exact opposite of that. You won't die at all. In fact, you would die. It's like man can't live on bread alone. Well, it turns out that man can live on meat alone. And that's the interesting truth about the whole diet.
People need to listen to kids. How many kids around the world, when they're first introduced to vegetables, turn their nose up and toss them off the plate, That's an instinctive reaction to vegetables from a human being who hasn't been programmed with the idea that they're nutritious and delicious
but they're not
and healthy.
They're anti-nutritious. That's one of those things. It's like, again, if you take the exact opposite of what is commonly accepted and told you, especially by the government and the FDA, the exact opposite is the truth.
Yep.
And the exact opposite is that grains are actually anti-nutritious. They will suck nutrients out of your body and they will hurt your body. It's like crazy. But they say, no, you have to have them. It's always the inverse with these people. They just tell you the exact opposite of the truth and people believe it.
Yeah, that's a pretty good idea for another show, We'll probably do that on carbs and meat and what you should eat and why fat is where it's at, as our famous Making Bacon song by Relic says. So, but I think we've kind of this show has run its course at this point. We're going to leave it there for this week.
Tired.
Jason's getting tired, I want to go to sleep. So that's.
I want to apologize in case I sounded incoherent. Like I was kind of getting incoherent. It's because I'm very tired. Normally I'm getting up very early in the morning, and staying up late is kind of harsh on me. So.
Yeah, it's bad for you.
Yeah. So
no worries, Jason.
I was getting incoherent there.
All right, folks. Thanks for listening in to our listeners and also to our callers who called in. We appreciate it. And
people should call in more. People
should call in. Because people think that. Oh, I don't know anything to say, or they already said that. But the point is that the way you, the listener, would say something, even if we have touched on it, would, lead us off in another direction, and it would be your particular viewpoint on it and the way you say it. So you shouldn't use that as an excuse not to call in. You should always call in.
And you should
if you
show
have a
love.
thought.
You
should show the love by calling in, yeah.
Yeah, show me love. You should
Jason is the love.
how much I love you.
Yes, specifically.
Like, Jason, we love you so much.
Yeah, like if everybody who calls in from now on prefaces a call with this one to say, Jason, I love you, and here's my question, and that would be great. So if you could do that,
yeah, if you could just do that and
that would make
call it a couple times and tell me how great I am.
Yeah. Feel free. There's no limit to the number of times you can tell Jason that you love him.
Exactly.
Yeah. Anyway, as I said, that's the end of this week's show, and we will be back next week in some form or other, and we'll have another topic to talk about. We don't know what it is yet, but
no, we won't actually.
Yes. Well, what do you mean?
No, we're going to make a little sort of artsy fartsy kind of attempt. We're basically going to have a radio show with no talking.
With some like
it's very
Radio Nouveau.
Yes, Nouveau radio.
With like
you're supposed to imagine what you're supposed to imagine what we would have said.
Can we have some interpretive jazz in there?
Yeah, we'll have some jazz playing all the time.
Discordant jazz.
We could do some miming.
The most important thing is what we didn't say.
Yeah, that's fodder for conspiracy theories right there. So, all right, folks. As I said, we'll see y'all when next week. Yeah,
next Sunday.
Week, next Sunday.
In
night.
the fullness of time.
Yes, in the fullness of time. That's a good way to end the show. So we will leave it there. Thanks to all. Bye.